On February 26, 2012, Trayvon Martin was on his way back home after visiting a local convenience store to pick up a bag of Skittles and an Arizona iced tea. Trayvon's story is one that we are all familiar with. He ended up crossing paths with an overzealous neighborhood watchman, George Zimmerman. George Zimmerman called 911 and reported Trayvon Martin as suspicious. The 911 operator told George Zimmerman, "Stay in your vehicle. We will send someone to come see about the situation." Ignoring the clear directions of the 911 operator, George Zimmerman exited his vehicle, and a few moments later, Trayvon Martin was no longer with us. The experience of Trayvon Martin brings up a number of questions for us. Among them being, how did stand your ground laws come to be a thing in the first place? Another question is, how in the world is George Zimmerman not being held civilly responsible for what he did to Trayvon Martin, even as he makes money from it? Another question one could ask is, what is the debate that took place in the capital of Florida that allowed stand your ground laws to be on the books in the first place? And by way of that question, how is it that that same law comes to be copied and pasted across the United States? And how might this intersect with neoliberalism and government austerity politics? These questions and more are answered in Marcus Lee's text, Originating Standing Your Ground, as well as today's lecture. However, whatever insights you may pull away from these texts in this lecture, one thing is clear: a system cannot fail those it was never built to protect. All right, hello everyone, and welcome to today's lecture. For today's lecture, we will be going over stand your ground laws, and we're going to look at the stand your ground laws through the lens of critical race theory and give an analysis so that you understand how critical race theory applies over laws and obviously the critique that it renders. And some of you all may say, hey, that's not a critique, that's just common sense. But we'll see by the time we get to the end of the lecture. So with that being stated, let's go ahead and jump into our roadmap for today. What is exactly that we will be covering? We're going to begin with the flashback. That way we understand our foundation and how we got here. Then we're going to move toward the origins of stand your ground so that we understand the lived experience that stand your ground laws comes up out of and who is represented there. Then we're going to look at the actual language of the law itself. We're going to look at what took place during the drafting of the bill. And we're also going to go over the conundrum of race, reason, and dog whistles that are within the law itself and were present throughout the law being shaped and formed within the state legislature, because Florida is the first state in the United States to give us the stand your ground laws. And then we're going to look at the goals and aims of stand your ground laws. And then we're going to end with looking at which states currently have stand your ground laws on the books as of 2024, those who have castle doctrine laws, and those who have a duty to retreat on their books. So with that being said, let's go ahead and get started with a flashback. And of course, we're going to begin with the social contract from Charles Mills, because that is what began our journey together. And what we understand by way of the social contract is that Western society as we know it today, that it is brought into being by way of a specific demographic who had a specific intent and meant the benefits of the society they erected to be for those persons and their posterity who created the society. Further, by reading Charles Mills, we understand that the social contract, which enjoined members of the ruling class together, was made possible by way of the racial contract. And to dive deeper into that, make sure you go back to the lecture from week 1 so that this all makes sense to you. From there, for week 2, we moved to studying Cheryl Harris's whiteness as property. It made clear that property is both tangible and intangible, that it accrues and retains value as well as extends rights. We studied how whiteness is enshrined in law as property in its intended privileges, benefits, protections, and entitlements are secured by way of law and public policy. We examined this through cases such as Plessy versus Ferguson, Brown versus Board of Education, Mosby tribe versus the town of Mosby, and Students for Fair Admissions versus Harvard. And again, you can go back to the week 2 lectures to unpack all of that. However, taken together, the social contract makes clear that it is the force that makes whiteness as property possible. that the rights, privileges, and recognition brought into being by way of the contract are solidified and enshrined in whiteness as a form of contrived property that is passed down from generation to ensure rights, protections, entitlements, and privileges are extended via whiteness as property and are both acknowledged and protected. Accordingly, as Cheryl Harris makes clear, those who possess whiteness as property are not necessarily guaranteed to win, but it is guaranteed that they will never lose. And again, for more on that and diving deeper into that, make sure that you visit the lectures from week 2. So let's go ahead and move forward to the key term that we need to know for today. So that way we understand Marcus Lee's article more clearly, as well as this arc, right, that critical race theory is laying out. And what is that term? That term is neoliberalism. And what is neoliberalism? It is an approach to governing and constituting society. It is an ideology that has transformed into a social construct. But what is it that we mean by neoliberal? We mean laws, statutes, public policy, judicial rulings, and executive orders which advance free market capitalism, deregulation, the transition of the economy and vital infrastructure and resources from the public sector as well as public oversight to the private sector and privately held ownership, while at the same time implementing an economic approach to government that is centered in austerity. That the government should reduce its spending. Now, importantly, neoliberalism, makes its appearance in the United States with Jimmy Carter, but takes hold during the presidency of Ronald Reagan and in the UK as Margaret Thatcher is serving as the prime minister. Specifically, Ronald Reagan's approach to the economy. Pay attention to this. Significant tax cuts for the wealthy, the busting of trade unions, the privatization of public services, and the outsourcing of services positioned the United States firmly as a neoliberal nation state, as Margaret Thatcher was doing the same in the UK. This was in the 1980s. How might this have reverberation to now? Now, important here is that neoliberalism, again, is a way of constituting society. It is a socio-political paradigm which advances that the market determines that everyone gets what they should have according to their value in work, while at the same time, watch this move, while at the same time ignoring the prerequisites of the social contract and how law protects the interests and rights and whiteness as a form of property. Do you see now why we started with the social contract as well as whiteness as property? So, accordingly, like Plessy versus Ferguson, Brown versus Board of Education, and Students for Fair Admissions versus Harvard, neoliberalism positions and frames, here we go, inequality and stratification as equal and fair, because it places the onus on the individual and the outcomes of the market, as opposed to looking at how society itself is constructed within the dictates of neoliberalism itself. Hence the term pull yourself up by your own bootstraps does not make any sense at all, because it presumes that, first of all, the person has boots in the first place and that society has not acted in such a way as to prevent the person from having access to boots, let alone the bootstraps, right? So within the United States, neoliberalism is then continued through the administrations of who? Bush, the father, Clinton, Bush, the son, Barack Obama, Joe Biden, and Donald Trump. What is key to understand here is that whether it is the left wing or the right wing, or the moderate tail center, it all floats the same bird. Hence, in his text, The Racial Contract that we studied in week 1, Charles Mills positions neoliberalism as simply the next phase in white supremacy as, quote, the unnamed political system that has made the world what it is today. In other words, what Charles Mills is getting at here is that to the extent that colonial powers still occupy native and indigenous lands, and racialized groups are othered via continuing social policies and institutions, then each iteration of the colonial state, regardless of who is in charge, is white supremacy in continuance. That is what Charles Mills would say. Now, with that foregrounding and with that understanding, let's now turn to stand your ground laws to understand where the worlds of stand your ground and neoliberalism, and by way of neoliberalism, the social contract and whiteness is property, where all of these worlds converge. So let's talk about the origin story of stand your ground. So in 2004, 4 hurricanes hit the state of Florida very, very hard. Those hurricanes were Jean, Ivan, Francis, and Charlie. Among the people impacted by these hurricanes was James Workman and his wife. They ended up having to live in FEMA housing because they were particularly impacted by Hurricane Ivan. As they are living in their FEMA trailer, who is on the grounds working among the FEMA workers, the many FEMA workers, is Rodney Cox, who is a contractor from North Carolina. As James Workman's wife is sitting in the FEMA provided trailer, she sees Rodney Cox outside on the grounds, checking on everything, and she presumes that she is in danger. Rodney Cox has not entered their temporary housing that they've been granted by FEMA, right? Despite the fact that neoliberalism calls for government defunding, right? Or austerity budgets. So despite the fact that they are living in FEMA housing, that Rodney Cox is a FEMA worker, James Workman's wife, who is disabled, perceives Rodney Cox, who's pictured here with the fish, to be a threat to their home. Accordingly, James Workman leaves out of the home, out of the temporary home provided by FEMA, and he unalives Rodney Cox. And what is taking place in this space is, as the hurricanes have happened, is this conversation of one should be able to protect one's property and one's land from looters, etc. We all know this conversation. But the caveat of this is that James Workman and his wife are not on their property. They are in housing, temporary housing, that is provided by FEMA. But by way of this discourse, Florida State Senator Darrell Peden, within the Florida Senate Criminal Justice Committee, introduces the Stand Your Ground law. And he says that, hey, I need to roll this out because people should have a right to protect their property. There's that word again, rights, protect property. This should all be sounding familiar to whiteness as property, right? In terms of rights, entitlements, protections, all, etc. Right? So here we go again with Florida State Senator Darrell Peden, and he says that folks should have a right to protect their property up to the point and beyond, or inclusive of, unaliving someone. And accordingly, he introduces the Stand Your Ground laws. And what is important to point out here, And this is going to have some type of resonance in whiteness as property. Well, not some type, it does have resonance in whiteness as property. Is that stand your ground laws are centered in the rights of the individual as opposed to groups and institutions. Because the United States as an institution, watch this, has its laws and statutes. Which means that everyone who is within the United States should be subjected to the laws and statutes. However, with the stand your ground law as being grounded in the rights of the individual, the rights of the individual are seen to exceed the laws and the customs of the nation state itself. And hence the question comes about, who has the right to lay claim to and exercise stand your ground laws as a right? Who can lean in on that? But in this instance, the rights of the individuals exceeds the bounds of the laws set by the institution and or the nation state itself. In other words, that the rights and entitlements of whiteness as a property is so embedded in law that it is seen to be more powerful than the nation state in which whiteness as property becomes enshrined in law. I hope you followed me there. So now let's take a look at the wording in the actual law itself for stand your ground. And this is paraphrased. It is lifted from Marcus Lee's text, just so that we can put it in more accessible language. And you'll want to pay attention to this because we're definitely going to unpack this. So, stand your ground, the law, the wording says this: a person is justified in using force, including the ability to unalive someone, to defend his or herself in any place where he or she has the right to be. This is the language of the law. If the person reasonably fears imminent peril. Quote, that the person is not obligated to retreat before using a force that could unalive someone, and that the person is immune from criminal prosecution and civil action. We're going to come back to this, but put a pin in this moment in terms of understanding the language and the stand your ground law. Now let's look to how the bill is drafted. So the original bill, in its original language, again, protects private citizens against criminal prosecution, detainment, and civil liability. Let's go back to whiteness as property, looking at page 1761. And what does Cheryl Harris say here? This is where all the lectures are going to begin to tie in here, and why we have established that foundation before we took off into understanding standing your ground laws. What does she say on page 1761? She says this in part. She says, as informed by the Lockean notion of the social contract, the autonomous free will of the individual is central. Who is she referring to here? John Locke. What is she leaning back on? The social contract. Do you all see how all of this is tying in? And then she says the autonomous free will of the individual is central. And here we are dealing with stand your ground laws. When in the original bill, and still as it exists today, the rights of the individual, the private citizen, is central as opposed to the nation state, the institution, and or a group. Now, why is this important? Because criminal prosecution in this instance, in the construction of the stand your ground law, a criminal prosecution was not necessarily defined as someone goes to court, they get convicted, etc. Rather, criminal prosecution was defined within the scope of this law as, quote, arresting, detaining in custody, and charging or prosecuting the defendant. That means even by mere arrest, even by detaining someone in custody. Do you see where the rub is happening with George Zimmerman here? That is considered a criminal prosecution, and that violates the rights of the individual. That is central. that is held within whiteness as property. That whiteness as property extends the rights, the entitlements, the protection that one who retains whiteness as property not be arrested or not be detained in custody. Are you all following this here? Now, why might this be important? Why might this particular aspect be important? And how does this map on to neoliberalism? Again, going back to the original draft of the law, that law enforcement agencies and states' attorneys would be liable for attorney's fees, court costs, loss of income, and all expenses incurred. In other words, that the stand your ground law enjoined itself to whiteness as a form of property, in so much as is that if one was arrested or detained, and this is in the original language of the law, what they were trying to get across, that if that happened, then that person incurred an injury and the state had to refund them their money because they could claim an injury. What does this sound like? Plessy versus Ferguson and what the judge said there. You all remember that? Go back to that lecture. I believe that was week 2, lecture 2. When the judge said that now if a person who was white was seated in the black section of the railroad car, that they would incur an injury and could sue for damages. And here we are looking at the stand your ground law in the 2000s, and we see the same thing manifesting. That not only is a person entitled to unalive someone by way of this law, but if law enforcement in the original language of the law was to actually arrest them, then not only was the law enforcement agency held liable, but so were the state's attorneys. And right now, I know you're probably saying, well, Antoine, that doesn't really make any sense. Don't just hang in there with me. We're going to connect it all together, right? But the key part in this, in connecting it to neoliberalism, at least up to this point in the lecture, is the fact that it kept the state from spending more money than needed and forced the acknowledgments of rights extended by way of whiteness as property to not arrest someone who unalives someone. Now, conventional thinking would say, okay, well, if someone is in my home, I have a right to unalive them. But hold your horses. Hold your horses right there, because the stand your ground law is going to be doing something else in just a moment, to where you'll see where this critique is coming in. Moreover than protecting a person from having to spend needless money out of their pocket, which we'll come back to in just a bit, the stand your ground bill also protected a claimant from the social stigma of criminal. This is referenced on page 9 in Marcus Lee's article, wherein the Florida state senator who introduced it, Darrell Peters, said not only, what are people having to, like people like James Workman are having to incur all of these costs, but they're also presumed to be a criminal. And what the implication of the argument here is that if one is presumed to be a criminal within this context, then one has to necessarily be injured, in that injury should be compensated by law. Notice the rights, entitlements, and protections that are taking place here. The other thing that the original law set to do was it set out to protect the right to act immediately. That to excuse those persons from spur of the moment decisions and split second moments. So when James Workman runs out of the trailer after Mr. Cox, who is nowhere in his home, he then is able to get excused from that because he acted on the spur of the moment in a split-second decision to protect white femininity that perceived a threat that was nowhere near their home. And moreover, that law was operating in such a way as to protect these individuals from harm. So Florida State Senator Darrell Peden has now introduced the law on the floor in the state capital of Florida. And there is a debate that happens here. And in the process of this debate, a few things become clear. And we're going to walk through this debate so that you see where and how it happens. But stand your ground laws then become racialized within this process in terms of who can access its rights. Also, what comes to be clear is this concept of neoliberalism and how it is threaded throughout stand your ground laws. Because what is prioritized is not necessarily that one should be held from conviction, but that one should not incur the cost of unaliving someone, that one should not be encumbered by that. And remember that this experience is being informed by James Workman, who unalived Mr. Rodney Cox because James Workman's wife thought that she was in fear of imminent peril, much like Carolyn Bryant and Emmett Till. But now let's take a closer look at what's happening on the Florida state floor here as relates to the conundrum of race, reason, and dog whistles, and how these politicians were going back and forth with one another over what would happen to State Senator Peden's bill. And one of the first things that comes up is Representative John Sealer, who is called Jack for short, has some concerns, not necessarily because of the legality of the law, but he says, listen, if we pass this law, this is going to open this up to everyone. And everyone's going to be able to access this. But we need to do something about gangs and street criminals. This is on page 12. And he accesses a dog whistle because of the ways in which gangs and street criminals are racialized and also contextualized by geography, right? Ian Haney Lopez has a wonderful book on dog whistles that everyone should check out. So Representative Sealer, who's a Democrat, by the way, which makes very clear whether it's the left wing, the right wing, or the moderate tail center, it all floats the same bird, right? But nonetheless, he says we got to do something here because everybody should not have access to this. And here we see this narrow tailoring that is happening. Go back to week 2. We see the narrow tailoring that is taking place here. In response to Representative Sealer, as well as other representatives on the floor, then you have Susan Busher, who is a Democrat. And she's saying, now listen, you have to make some sense of this reasonable fear of imminent peril because this does not make sense. Whose reasonability are we centering here and why? In other words, who is the person who is in fear of imminent peril? Should it be Mr. Cox, who's in imminent fear of peril, and therefore we should be looking at Mr. Workman and his wife? Or is it Mr. Workman and his wife who are seen to be in fear of imminent peril? Whose experiences are we centering and why? This comes to inform the law and further hitch it to whiteness as property, which itself is backed up by the social contract, itself reinforced by the racial contract that we already went to. So far on the House floor, as they narrowly tailor this law, and I'm going through this process for a reason, as they narrowly tailor standing your ground, Representative Sealer is saying we gotta say, gangs and street criminals cannot take advantage of this. Knowing what type of image that conjures up, right? In likeness to Reagan when he was talking about the welfare queens and drug dealers, and George Bush when he did the Willie Horton political ad. If you're not aware of that, go look it up on YouTube and you'll know immediately what I'm talking about. The Representative Busher says, hey, we got a problem with reasonable fear of imminent peril here, because who are we centering? Along those lines, then you have folks like Representative Shelley Vann, who's a Democrat. And she says, listen, I want to ask some questions myself as well. If you go to page 14 of the reading, she says this, quote, I'm trying to find out some practical applications and what would happen in certain circumstances. So could you tell me in watch whose experience she's about to mirror here? right? I'll give you a hint, or I'll just tell it to you. It is James Workman's wife. So she says, could you tell me if I am in my house, except for James Workman's wife was in a FEMA home. We all know this, right? And I have insomnia. I get up, it's pitch black outside. I see someone standing outside of my house, in my lawn, on my lawn, or close to my lawn, getting ready to throw something at my house. Would I be justified in using force because I thought someone was going to throw something at my house that could harm me? Could I unalive that person? A Republican representative replies to her and says this: Representative Vanna, you don't always have time to evaluate in 2 seconds what a potential assailant's intention is. And if you believe that they are using force to do harm to you and your family, that they are attacking you, then you have the right to protect yourself, your property, your home, your family, right? Sounds reasonable, except Representative Vanna comes back and says, thank you, Representative Baxley. So you're telling me that in this scenario, I could unalive my paper delivery person and be justified in doing so. And in using this particular hypothetical, obviously she's speaking to what happened with Rodney Cox. That he is a FEMA worker, that he is on the grounds, that he is supposed to be there. Right? Because there are some things that the stand your ground law is seeking to do in terms of who should be in a place and who should not be in a place. And the point that Representative Vanna is making clear during this debate is, listen, the newspaper person is supposed to be there. Mr. Cox was supposed to be there, and this happened, and this law makes no sense. And in response to her, remember, we're talking about the debate that's happening on the floor. You have people like Representative Jeff Kaufman, Cotcamp, who says this. If you look on page 15, he says that, how many times have you heard, you better not go to a certain part of town because that's a bad part of town? And what is he trying to do? That's going to be important to the stand your ground law. He's trying to say that stand your ground should not only apply to one's home, but also to one's person. That wherever that person is and they have a right to be. Right? That's his argument. All of this is taking place on the floor during this debate. And then you have folks like Representative Rod Smith, who's a Democrat, who says that, listen, we need to further narrowly tailor this to say those who are engaged in unlawful activity are not allowed to take advantage of this law. But then what makes up unlawful activity? Is it jaywalking? Is it running a red light? What is it? Is it walking on someone's lawn who is private property by mistake and the sidewalk happens to be right there? What is the unlawful activity? So the law is narrowly tailored in such a way that it restricts the rights of certain folks who cannot take advantage of it, while employing the rights of those who can take care of it. Who can take advantage of it. Representative Smith then says that we need to further narrowly tailor this to make sure that it's only law-abiding citizens and that the clean hand doctrine should apply here. But then the dog whistle of law-abiding citizen is also informed by race and class. And when he says clean hand doctrines, what that is that when one comes to court, one has to come with clean hands, meaning that you haven't done anything manipulative, you haven't pre-planned anything, that all of this happened in the spur of the moment, you have clean hands. But what that presumes is that there is no racial bias. What that presumes is that one is seen to be in place, quote unquote, and that someone else is seen to be what? Out of place. All of this is taking place during the debate of this bill, getting to the original language of the bill. And so this conundrum pops up between race, who is reasonable, and the use of dog whistles. And when they end up finally getting the final rendering of the bill, which we're going to talk about in just a few seconds, dog whistles are woven throughout the bill in such a way that black and brown persons are not able to claim a stand your ground defense. But rather, stand your ground defense is reserved for those persons who are beneficiaries of the social contract that is underwritten by the racial contract that allows for whiteness as property, to come into being that extends them rights, entitlements, and protections as well as privileges. What did the final rendering of this bill do? Now that we know why State Representative Peden bought the bill, the story behind the bill, we know of some of the debate that's happening on the floor and the concerns that came out of that. What did this bill ultimately do? The goals and the aims and implications are mainly three things. First of all, when it finally got out of the debate process, the Stand Your Ground law codified the expansion of castle doctrine in law. Castle doctrine meaning that if you're in your home, you have a right to defend your home, from any intrusion, different things of that sort. But what it did was it expanded castle doctrine to public spaces. And this is how we get a George Zimmerman. That an individual is allowed to determine who is in place and out of place. That's something very serious to take into consideration. That wherever one who belongs to the dominant self finds themselves to be, it is their home. That they are given control of public space. And this is not theoretical, this is real. This is why critical race theory is important. It provides the analysis of law. This is how whiteness as property becomes real, because it provides the lived experience of law. Not just law as it is written, de jure, but law as it is lived, de facto, in custom, in social norms. What is the second thing that Stand Your Ground does in its goals and aims? That it assumes the private citizen retains reasonable fear of imminent peril. An example, looking at George Zimmerman again, that the law assumed that his actions were reasonable. Even though the 911 operator said, do not get out of that car, he got out anyway, and it assumed that that was reasonable. That if he had fear of imminent peril, common sense would perhaps say, stay in the vehicle or move the vehicle. But instead, he gets out of the vehicle, and that move is seen as what? Reasonable, even under the fear of imminent peril. In other words, I am afraid that fear of imminent peril is coming. And that's the part B of that. That it assumes that that fear is in fact reasonable. So not only is the action itself reasonable, but that the fear of the fear is reasonable, even if there is nothing there. So then the racialized, the class, and the gendered psychological processes and cognitive processes of the individual who may have racialized bias then becomes reasonable by way of law. Because that person can have fear of imminent peril without imminent peril even being present. Again, Trayvon Martin was minding his own business. The third thing is that the law seeks to do in its goals and aims is immunity against both criminal prosecution and civil action. What does this mean? It means that when we look at Stand Your Ground laws, you can't just say, okay, well, a person is kept from criminal prosecution. That's part of it. The other part of this is that they get to do what they want to do for free. That this person is not to incur any harm to their actual real estate property, their accounts, their vehicles, that they are not held accountable. In other words, that the third tenet of this, that immunity is granted for criminal and civil action, that one's reasonable fear of imminent peril is backed up by no consequences, that there should be no harm that becomes these individuals that are able to take advantage of this narrowly tailored law that utilize dog whistles in such a way such that only those who possess whiteness as property are able to take advantage of it. And in this way, those persons come to regulate public spaces, right? And in some instances, also private spaces. This would be, someone knocking on your home door saying, excuse me, you're a little too loud, and we're trying to get rest, and it's creating fear and anxiety for my dog and my children. And the next thing you know, the cops are knocking at your door. And what chain of events might that set off? We've seen this happen before across the United States. So before we close out here, let's go back to the actual law itself so we can understand what's happening here. And here is where we combine Charles Mills, Cheryl Harris, and Marcus Lee. We're going to put this all together here. So the stand your ground law does what? It says that a person is justified, before we even go that far, a person, who a person is by way of the debate on the Florida state floor, then becomes qualified. Who is and is not a person. Those who are in gangs are not considered a person. Those who are considered street criminals are not a person. Those who are considered to be engaged in unlawful activity is not a person, even if it's jaywalking. So then a person within the scope of this law then becomes qualified. And the law becomes narrowly tailored. And the law goes on. So let's keep reading. So a person who is justified in using force, including unaliving someone, to defend his or herself in any place. There is the expansion of the castle doctrine. In any place where he or she has a right to be. In other words, that those persons who take advantage of the law that is narrowly tailored, who's accessing whiteness as property, that anywhere they are, they have a right to be. Anywhere they are, they have a right to be and a right to utilize this law. And it says this. Has a right to defend his or herself in any place where he or she has a right to be if the person reasonably fears imminent peril. So then the bias that is there becomes a type of fear of imminent peril. That the person is they're not obligated to retreat before using deadly force, and that the person is immune from criminal prosecution in civil action. So then, Trayvon Martin's life does not even have a value within the court system because George Zimmerman is protected from criminal prosecution in civil action. And so it was during Dred Scott and Plessy Ferguson that black folks have no rights to which the white man is bound to respect, as the Chief Justice said. The same thing now. That in the split moment that one says, oh, I'm in fear for my life. Which is the danger in that. Stop doing that if you're in a stand your ground state. Stop doing that. Because that reinforces the non-personhood of non-white persons. And so it's not only that the stand your ground law protects against criminal conviction, but it also connects to this neoliberal turn that the United States is in. Because it keeps the federal government from spending money, federal and state governments from spending money. It preserves the property, rights, entitlements, and privileges of those who retain whiteness as property. And it allows those who are non-white persons, when they encounter those who leverage this law or claim this right, to be seen as non-persons within the eyes of the law. We end on this note. Here are the states with stand your ground laws. Castle doctrine as well as duty to retreat. We've already went over stand your ground laws. And what you have to understand is what happened in Florida influenced the nation state. So all the states that you see in green are stand your ground law states, and they mapped their laws onto their states by way of what happened in Florida. And this was done by way of the American Legislative Exchange Council as well as the National Rifle Association. They made that possible. And then you have your states with castle doctrine laws that comes up by way of castle doctrine. That comes up by way of common law and says that if someone enters your home, you have a right to defend yourself, right? And to the extent, I think we all find that understandable. But it is the stand your ground laws that encompass the vast majority of the nation that says wherever these persons find themselves, they have a right to be there. And if they have fear of imminent peril, then they have a right to do a certain thing. And in this way, the subjugation of black people and people of color continue. Because even with stand your ground laws, the laws are narrowly tailored such that those who retain whiteness as property, are able to claim the right in the law because that right is backed up by the social contract, which in and of itself is also backed up by the racial contract. This is today's lecture. I'll see you next time. Peace.